want to begin by thanking Sophie, Michael, and Marlene and Daniel for creating this wonderful space for collective reflection on theory. Being placed on this particular session feels like the perfect opportunity to reflect on how narrative and theory. Oops, this is moving.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. To reflect on how narrative and theory shape one another, and I'll try to do so by drawing on a particular strand of my research that is especially close to my heart. So for the past decade, I've been working and learning alongside Muslim artists, musicians, and craftspeople in the beautiful yet chaotic city of Istanbul. I've had the privilege of apprenticing in the Sufi reed flute, the Ney, or the Nai in Arabic, under the guidance of my teacher, Ney master and craftsman Salih Bilgin, and of studying Islamic calligraphy with Sevim Bayazid. At its core, this research explores the intimate connections between art, ethics, and pedagogy, asking how does skillful engagement with materials and the apprenticeship relations that sustain it open alternative pathways for living a Muslim life in contemporary Turkey today. And over these 10 years, this work has culminated into a range of different narrative forms, including an ethnographic monograph and less ethnographically tuned forms of writing, the building of an archival repository for a museum, and also the first steps toward an ethnographic filmmaking. So drawing upon this trajectory, I want to ask today, what have I really learned about theory through my collaborations with Muslim artists, masters, and craftspeople? This question allows me to get a feel for theory by moving back and forth between anthropological knowledge and craft knowledge. And these two forms of knowing are, we might say, in a really good companionship relationship for a range of reasons. Well, first of all, they're both forms of knowledge that are acquired and refined through a continuous loop of learning by doing. Craftspeople constantly experiment, adjust, discard, recalibrate until form and function start to align. As anthropologists, we do something similar. Writing and theory emerge through repeated cycles of drafting and redrafting, juxtaposing concepts and field encounters and subjective accounts, until something starts to feel like it's working to eliminate a particular problem. So theorizing in that sense is less a sudden revelation than a process of tinkering, sanding, and shaping. And secondly, both forms of knowledge are also inseparable from their immediate context. Right? A name maker, my teacher would know very well that reeds from different regions of Turkey behave very differently in the workshop environment. And similarly, we could say anthropological concepts, they also acquire meaning through their ethnographic grounding. Thirdly, attention to materials and attention to concepts share a kind of deep kinship. Artisans treat materials as having their own affordances and resistances. Anthropologists also treat concepts similarly, I would say. Theory is not something that is infinitely pliable, but it comes with its own genealogies and histories and sometimes internal tensions as well. So the grain of concepts, like the grain of wood, must be worked with care. And finally, just as, this is my favorite point, so I kept it to the last, just as craft knowledge is transmitted through apprenticeship, anthropological knowledge also relies on apprenticeship, something that some of you or many of you are going through because you're attending graduate training, reading canonical texts, emulating certain ways of thinking and writing, and gradually developing your own hand. So following that really broad crisscrossing between anthropological knowledge and craft knowledge, I want to focus more specifically on 3 points that I want to move on to in the remainder of my time. And of course, all of these points have already been made. There's nothing much novel to say from me. But I raise them not to sound prescriptive or didactic in any way, but really in the spirit of reflection, I want to ask what these 3 points, which are really more moments that I've sort of encountered in my own apprenticeship trajectory, I want to think what they might reveal to us about some common assumptions concerning theory. So the first point brings us back to the methods theory package, as Sonia called it in the first session, and perhaps a familiar way in which we might often think about methods as a practical side or component of doing research, the hands-on, more about the how of the research practice and process. Theory, on the other hand, is often imagined as abstract, a term that has been used a lot today in some of the panels. Something that is, a bit more sort of closer to scholarship, the literature, those conceptual and theoretical ideas that we borrow from other scholars to make sense of the world. But what apprenticing in the art skills for the past decade or longer now, what that has taught me is that theory doesn't have to be this abstract scaffolding. Opening oneself to the transformative effects of doing a practice, whatever that might be, is already a form of theorizing in action, a way of knowing by doing. And one doesn't need to be doing an apprenticeship-style ethnography, I think, to appreciate or see the validity of this point. The very act of doing fieldwork is always involving making constant interpretive decisions, right? Noticing patterns, constantly framing our questions. And I think these practices, as humble as they might sound or be, they generate our theoretical insights. So if I may return to the craft analogy for a second, craft knowledge is also not always practical, the way we often imagine it, but it also relies on implicit understandings of how materials behave, causation, and form. So the boundary between concrete methods and abstract theory is rather porous. Methods can be profoundly theoretical, and theory is, I would say, based on my own apprenticeship-based work, it's really grounded, really anchored in the material, in the procedural and relational work of the field. And this one really brings me to my second point, narrative as theory. I think Nikita has already set it up nicely for me. So when we are in the field and when we start creating these pools of anecdotes, vignettes, or digital material, we already start to build theory or shape theory in narrative form. So in a nutshell, this is my point. So narratives are not just illustrations of theory, but it is equally the ground where theory emerges. So narratives are generative of theory, a mode of theorizing. Our theoretical insights often emerge from a narrative, right? A vignette in the field, perhaps a remembered moment, an interlocutor's metaphor. A well-told story can crystallize a theoretical idea, making it tangible, making it thinkable. You probably all know very well how in Clifford Geertz's famous essay, Deep Play, the anecdotal story, i.e. the narrative itself, does all the theoretical work, right? The cockfights are a form of deep play, dramatizing social status, masculinity, forms of hierarchy. So in that sense, the anecdotal story is not simply illustrating some pre-existing insights or concepts, but it's generating them. And in that sense, I think anecdotes are not just anecdotal. Anecdotes are never merely anecdotal. As anthropologist Ismail Alatas observes, they concretize knowledge rather than focusing, let's say, on the psychological depth of characters, something that we might expect to see or read in a contemporary novel. The anecdotal form does something really interesting. It lends itself seamlessly to documenting unfolding social life, right, which might be an encounter, a certain practice or interaction, while simultaneously rendering these encounters as analytically interesting, important, and legitimate knowledge. And I think it's this generative quality of anecdotes that makes them so central to writing ethnography. So in this sense, theory doesn't arrive in a vacuum, but it is storied. This is something that starts early on in our fieldwork as we start taking notes, creating those pools of diary notes. And I would also say that it is precisely in this moment that I think anthropologist craft shares its deepest resonance with artisanal knowledge. theory doesn't pre-exist the work, but emerges through telling, shaping, and sequencing lives and objects into stories. At the Ney workshop, my teacher stands before a table piled with reed stalks, picking up each in turn, examining its knot segments and proportions, and deciding which tuning the reed should become. What do you want to be, he asks. Now, even this very, very brief narrative moment carries multiple layers of meaning, or theoretical insights, we could say. It proposes an ontology of objects, that each reed is a being with its own capacities and constraints. It also gestures towards an epistemology, that knowing the world arises through our sensuous engagements with materials, by seeing the reed, by touching the reed, experimenting with it. That's how one comes to sense the sonic and musical possibilities the material affords. The key point here is that my teacher's question, what do you want to be, is not simply some raw data waiting for me to apply theory to it later. The anecdote itself is theory in narrative form, generating a conceptual insight. That is an encounter with objects that makes room for them to exist in the world in their own terms. So to take stock, my first point was to say that theory is, again, doesn't have to be this abstract scaffolding. I'm going to bring it back to the field practice and really emphasize that it's something grounded in the material, in the procedural and relational work of the field. My second point is to reclaim narrative not as an add-on, but as a generative of theory, something that does the work for us. So my third and final point shifts to a slightly different concern. Again, that's something we've already started picking up on in the previous session. Theory building is inherently dialogical and co-constructed, and it is by no means limited to the authority of us as the researcher or writer. We might often imagine doing theory as a solitary task, sitting at one's desk surrounded by books and notes, but fieldwork itself can also be a site where our interlocutors are also engaged in theory building through their own reflections, through their sharing of stories and assessments of what happened. Not because we automatically adopt those ideas, but because their activity is itself theorizing, a form of theorizing. Salih Hoca cuts my playing midway. You haven't practiced enough, he says. Some things in music cannot be grasped immediately. You must play them repeatedly. He picks up the name himself and demonstrates, playing the same passage over and over and over. Mastery comes from repetition, he explains. Even the saintly Ibn Arabi, who prayed faithfully from age 7 until his death at 95, reflected, if I hadn't performed my namaz over the last year, what state would I be in? To fully experience even a single perfect namaz may require a lifetime of practice. So is this just some feedback on my bad playing or a theory of repetition in action? I would say the latter, of course. By weaving Islamic prayer and Ney playing together through the means of analogy, my teacher does nothing less than building a theory about the importance of repetition as a principle of practice and skilled mastery, something that extends also down to other domains of life, including one's doing of their prayers. So notice here how, not just how the way I wrote this anecdote in my own work, but also the very narrative form that my teacher uses, which is analogy, is really helping him to do the theoretical, to generate that theoretical insight. In fact, Salih Hoca often taught to us through really profound way of using metaphors and analogies, always crisscrossing between different practices and different domains of life. And it is precisely his use of narratives that became really central to then how I started thinking about the kinds of alternative Muslim practices and subjectivities that I was discovering in my fieldwork, and then theorized that kind of idea in my book, Musical Ethics and Islam, and sort of more precisely use the word exploratory way of engaging with Islam. That sort of became a key concept in the book. But whose theoretical insight was that? Was that mine? Was that my teacher's? Or both? So my point here is that theory building is never the product of a singular me, sorry, not the right page. Our interlocutors continuously generate insights and they assemble their own versions and visions of the world. And those visions and versions always provoke reflection and shape the analytical work we do. And thinking about the question of what is theory along these lines can also perhaps get us a different, not necessarily a better grasp, I wouldn't argue that, but a different type of grasp about some of the other key terms that are really central to the anthropological lexicon. Of course, fieldwork is one of them. Fieldwork is not simply a process of data gathering or data collection. It is really a space of dialogical theory building where anthropological and interlocutor ways of thinking and doing are entangled and mutually generative, even when we don't fully agree with our interlocutors. And similarly, ethnography, we might say, is not just applying theory to our data, it's crafting narratives that theorize. So in conclusion, if I may compress my 3 points into a single sentence, theory is not abstract or solitary. It emerges through practice, through narrative, and through dialogue. Thank you.